Hello and welcome to Inform Friday. I'm Lila Angelaka and I work for Historic Environment Scotland in the technical research team. If you are new to this is a series of discussions about traditional buildings where we are presenting a short topic each time followed by a live Q&A. We also introduce you to our Inform series and each session is corresponding to one or more of our published guides. These are short publications giving technical advice for homeowners and covering the basics on a number of topics. As you might be aware if you joined our previous lives, our autumn and winter Informed Friday series are focused around the impact of climate change on traditional buildings. And our previous live, we talked about energy efficiency in traditional buildings. You can still watch this on YouTube if you would like to do so, because we did have some questions relating to energy efficiency, which is not going to cover it exactly today. So as we mentioned before, one of the main impacts of climate change in Scotland is increased precipitation and occurrence of severe weather events. So today we will talk about what this means and in the context of buildings, specifically, what we can do to make them cope better with the changing climate. Today, I would also like to introduce you to our climate impact and adaptation trainee, Molly Harkins, who will give us a short presentation on climate change impact in Scotland. But we will also have Roger, as usual, who will join us more at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. As usual, if you would like to ask us a question, you can do this now via our Facebook page or log into our YouTube channel with your Google account. The event will also be recorded and available afterwards to watch at your own leisure. If we don't manage to answer your question today, as we usually say, please send us an email at technicalresearch@hgs.scot. So hello, Molly, to you.
Thank you, Leila. And so I'm going to be giving a brief overview of Scotland's climate and what that could look like in the future, and then also a couple of examples of these impacts on buildings. So Scotland has a temperate maritime climate, and we're influenced by lots of different air masses, which means our weather can often be unpredictable and changeable. But overall, we receive mild winters and warm summers, and we rarely experience extreme weather events that other parts of the world do. Within that, we have a lot of regional variation, in part due to coastal and inland locations, rain-bearing winds from the west, and mountainous regions which shelter much of the east from the rain that the west receives. Now, we know that our climate has been changing since the Industrial Revolution, where we started emitting vast amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. On your screen now is an infographic from the Met Office's State of the Climate Report for 2020. This is an annual report that gives information on that year's climate in comparison to previous years and trends. A couple of the key things I want to bring out here are that 2020 was the third warmest, the fifth wettest, and the eighth sunniest since records for each of these measures began, all of which being in the top 10, which is the first time that has happened in a single year. 2020 was also one of the least snowy on records, and we're seeing sea levels continue to rise. Looking to the future, these trends are going to continue, and climate projections can give us possible futures for Scotland using emission scenarios, which are based on the extent to which we continue to emit greenhouse gases globally. This graph here is from Adaptation Scotland's climate projection summary for Scotland, and it's showing high and low emission scenarios for summer temperature change in Scotland until the year 2100, compared to the baseline of the 1981 to 2000 average. The solid blue and red lines show the low and high emission scenarios, and then the shaded areas show the possible range for each of those scenarios. At the moment, we're most closely aligned with a medium-high emission scenario, but we're largely locked into the climate that we will receive until around 2050, where you can see that the summer temperature change is around 1.5 degrees by then. And the extent to which we continue to emit greenhouse gases globally will impact our future climate. And you can see that the difference between the low and high emission scenarios grows and grows towards the end of the 21st century. So actions like the cutting down of fossil fuels, as agreed at COP26 a couple of weeks ago, is a really important action to limiting emissions and also limiting global warming. So that was 1.5 degrees change for summer temperature by 2050, and our summers will also be around 8% drier by then. But we will still get some extreme rainfall events in the summer. For winter, by the end of the century, the warming is a little bit less than in the summer, but still around 1.5 degrees by 2050 and 12% wetter. We'll still get extreme weather events such as the beast from the east that we had in 2018, but overall Scotland will have reduced frost and reduced snowfall in the winter months. High winds like we had over the last week or so may increase as well, but that's with a little bit less certainty than the temperature and rainfall trends that I've described there. So on your screen now, you should be seeing our guide to climate change impacts on the historic environment. This one here is for roofed buildings and infrastructure, but the publication covers all the different types of sites that we look after here. And it covers some of the changes that I've mentioned and also the impact. So to go through a few, we've got increased rainfall causing saturation of building fabric, biological growth and increased rates of decay. Heavy rainfall causing landslides and ground movement and instability in our buildings. Increased occurrence of floods and increased severity of floods as well, and extreme weather events like storms causing damage to buildings as well. And then higher temperatures causing overheating in our buildings too. Not mentioned here are coastal impacts. So I mentioned before that our sea levels are continuing to rise, and that will cause coastal flooding and also coastal erosion. So my final point is just to say that it's important that we understand all of the possible impacts in a changing climate when we look to adapting our buildings and places, and not just those that are in our immediate future. And now back to Leila, who will give you some more specific examples of the impacts for our buildings.
That's great. Thank you very much, Molly. Molly will stay in to answer questions at the end. So just to summarize, as Molly explained, climate change in Scotland is characterized by milder but wetter winters. And so you have probably incidents of landslides, generally higher winds, storms, and a greater frequency of severe weather events. So this image shows kind of a rural cottage and what could happen. So as been sort of said before, the extreme weather events are becoming more common. So for example, January 2012 were the highest winds ever recorded for many parts of Scotland. So there's an increased risk of coastal flooding from storm surges, and in some areas there is basically threat from coastal erosion and sea level rise. So this is just a quick image to show you, that's Thrieve Castle, I believe, just to see it in pictures. So more specifically though, what does that do to the buildings? When older buildings are subjected to high moisture loads through persistent heavy or driven rain, the masonry can get saturated. Damp walls can lead to the leaching of binder from the wall core, causing instability of the wall. So I don't know if you can see from that sort of image, but it actually shows you what, I guess it shows you a defect downpipe and how the water sort of penetrates the masonry, gets saturated, and then the lime is leaching. We also have more surface runoff, which means it results in higher moisture levels in external walls or adjacent areas. And also moisture from soils can contaminate porous masonry with damaging salts, which can cause or accelerate stone decay. In addition, the use of incompatible materials such as cement renders or impervious paints used externally or internally can disrupt the necessary movement of moisture and further impede the drying process. Also, internally, we have higher relative humidity levels and damp, which can lead to timber decay on the linings. So additional measures such as insulation with vapor barriers or blocking natural ventilation pathways, or even systems like tanking can actually hinder the drying process. So we generally advise against them. And remember, we've kind of talked a lot about this in our previous lives. Poor ventilation increases the risk of condensation, mold growth, and timber decay. So it's quite important to allow for sufficient ventilation throughout the building. So first and foremost, before we talk about adaptation of traditional buildings, we need to talk about maintenance as always. But maintenance following the principles of breathable construction, which means using natural materials such as stone, lime, and timber. These have proved to be enduring and effective in traditional construction. Often buildings have been poorly maintained or altered in such a way as to increase their vulnerability to severe weather. And there may be a history of poor maintenance or just a backlog of repairs by using the sort of incorrect materials or a poor appreciation of the detailing. And there's also obviously the difficulty with access and working at heights. So this graph or this image actually shows you how a defect gable would look like, and not well maintained gable. And to the right is some things to note how this should be looked at and maintained. So obviously you can see it's a lot about pointing, especially a higher level. Keep the levels, the ground levels, where they should be, and vents cleared. So just to show you a few things, but we have done a previous live which have covered some of these issues, and we are likely to do one again on maintenance specifically. So I will now start from top to bottom as we look at the building. So the most exposed element is actually chimney stacks, and it's also hard to access. So check for vegetation growth and mortar joints and repair these as soon as possible. Another point of weakness for water penetration are the gables, as we mentioned just before. And dampness in gable walls is most commonly due to a combination of defects in the chimney, the skews, the masonry pointing, and frequently blocked rounds and downpipes. Often cement pointing or renders can actually exacerbate the problem, as cement can be vulnerable to cracking, which allows water to be drawn in and become trapped. The next image actually is a close-up of a detail of a traditional building. This is a raised molding on the upper skew copes, and this little detail is actually there to ensure the effective runoff of water. The width of the skew cope is quite important to give a bit of an overhang. Some buildings don't have overhang, some of them have more than others. And this is to show that additional detailing may be required to use skew copes to deal better with water runoff, especially if there've been a lot of changes and renders. This tends to kind of disappear over time. So just make sure that you have that to have this effective runoff of water. Traditionally, also, you would have different kinds of channels to direct water to the slates or skew puts. So the first image, I'm not sure if you can see that clearly, but kind of at the bottom of the skew copes, there's a little channel that's going diagonally. And again, this is to direct water to the last row of the tiles and onto the gutters. And there's another image as well, which is a different kind of channel, which is going along from top to bottom. This is quite weathered, so yeah, that's actually better shown here. And again, this is the same thing to kind of collect the water there and direct it away from the building. So these were traditional details. And when these are absent or failing, sometimes it's because nothing to do with the design of the building, just that they're not sufficient anymore. They can't cope with the changing weather. So the detailing can be adapted. Then some ways you can actually adapt beyond the traditional detailing is you can go a bit more. So here this image shows you a lead skew. This is quite a drastic measure and usually done when other repairs are not possible. Fastenings are important for this to avoid wind lift. And another approach, which is not actually shown here, we didn't have an image, but in some cases, defective skew copes can be rebedded onto a lead damp-proof course to provide extra protection, I guess, against water ingress. If this approach is taken, the copes need to be secured in place by additional fixings to avoid slippage. So it's important here to remember not just to add something to adapt your building, but actually to fix it appropriately so it doesn't get lifted by wind. Another approach, which is kind of in between, is the secret gutter and half cloaking. So you might be able to see here how the lead is covering half of the skew coping, and then it goes underneath the slates. So this is what we call secret gutter and half cloaking. Now, I talked a little bit about overhang before. So when there is no overhang, the slates is chamfered to drive the water towards the middle of the slate below. So you might see in that image all the slates on the side, on the left side, they are chamfered. So this is again to direct the water to the middle of the falling slate and then down to the gutters. In some locations, lime mortar is used to close gaps in a pantile roof, if we have a pantile roof. But the addition of lime mortar, which is called torching or bedding, might be necessary where wind-driven rain or wind lift is causing problems. I mean, in Scotland, we do have the sarking, so usually I'm not sure how often the torching is used, but you do see it sometimes. Later buildings have mortar fillets or lead skew. You will see in that picture. It's not very clear, obviously, because it's a drawn picture, but typically the junction is finished with a weak cement mortar and a lead soaker that goes underneath the skew copes. You might be able to see basically the lead is shown to go underneath the skew copes. Also, traditionally, the slates are on an angle near the skews to direct water to kind of the middle side, well, the middle, to let's say the middle of the roof. You also have water gates or secret gutters, which are additional features for large volumes of water, as we showed earlier. So it's best to actually properly look at that, because there are various options, and there might be an option that's better for your own building. So it's a case-by-case scenario. And also lead trough can be formed at the eaves and ruggled into the skew. That's actually what you see in that image. And then the slates are dressed over. This is quite a durable approach, but it does require you to kind of remove the skew copes, I guess, and put them back in. We talked a lot about this before in our previous lives about rainwater goods and rainwater management, but generally warmer temperatures and wetter winters may result in increased vegetation growth with potential to block your rainwater goods. So as we said before, just check twice a year, especially just after a storm. And you may need to consider having wider gutters if your gutters are not the original ones, or if they're not coping sufficiently. That's another thing you will have to maybe look at. Onto the walls, I guess. So generally, while the biggest water ingress is chimney heads and skew copes, walls also matter. And even well-maintained masonry walls with good detailing may need additional protection from driving rain. This was understood in traditional construction, and rubble masonry was commonly protected by a layer of lime harling and a finishing coat of lime wash. And rubble work by its nature consists of a higher proportion of exposed joints and was often used on side or rear elevations or buildings of lower status, which were then protected by a lime harl or lime wash. Hard cement-based renders do not help with water retention, whereas traditional lime harling, by contrast, is well suited to provide the additional protection which is needed against wind-driven rain. The relatively flexible nature of lime reduces the incidence of hairline cracking, while the open pore structure allows water vapor dispersal and prevents the buildup of moisture in a masonry wall. The image you see here actually shows traces of original render on the gable end of a late 18th century building in Stirling. And most buildings would have had a sort of a coating to protect them from the weather elements. So reinstatement of external lime coatings has been proven to be effective in managing the effects of wind-driven rain in exposed locations. So historically, harling of any thickness was normally finished by several coats of lime wash, as we said before. And this was giving a water-resistant finish and was also filling any cracks, which provided protection from rain and splashes at ground level. So following this approach, we've actually done a case study where we adapted a gable wall that was not originally actually lime hurled, and we added a lime mortar, lime render, and then lime washes. So this is the half sand case study, which you can look at, just to show you also how buildings can be adapted using traditional methods. Another thing we kind of touched upon very quickly on a previous slide, but it's about the detailing of buildings and their architecture. And one of the main features, one of the key features, is parapets and cornices. Often the importance of the details on parapets and cornices is not really appreciated. At the highest level of a building, they are the most exposed elements. In areas of high exposure, the remodeling of parapet or cornice details may be required, just to make sure you have the protection you need to the masonry below, and to avoid any long-term damage. This can often be done with a careful use of sheet, lead, or zinc, as you can see here. So following similar approach to what we showed before about basically raggling it into the parapets. So if we can zoom in to the picture to the right a bit, just so you can see lead here has been used to cover the parapet. And you can see how it's kind of tilted to go sort of chamfer to go out, so you can direct water away from the parapet. And then you can see there's another lead sheet that's going between the parapet and the roof, creating a gutter, which is called parapet gutter actually. So there are many ways to adapt your building to cope better with the increased precipitation. And in some cases, the addition of a drip detail on the underside of a sill ledge should be considered as well, which we have a picture just to show. No, it's sorry, it's the next image, where you can actually adapt your windows. So if there is no if there's no sill, or the sill is flush, that's another thing to be considered. So this photo shows you a new drip detail which has gone into the bedding mortar of the sill on a 19th century window. And again, that's to help shed the water away better. Another approach is to use additional string courses. So you see on that image, it actually it matches the building, and that's an approach that's, it's quite intrusive because you're altering the the architecture of the building, but at the same time it does match the building, and it is designed to help shed the water away using traditional methods. Also, just to look at the ground level now, as rainfall levels increase, solid ground floors may be vulnerable to wetting from raised water tables, water runoff from adjacent areas, or splashback, especially if there's a lot of hard landscaping around. And it's very common also to see new roads being laid next to buildings, and this is not really considered what the effect on the buildings is. So drainage to properties should be adequately managed to ensure the water is effectively dispersed away from the structure. And for example, with the formation of gullies or drainage pipes below ground, down pipes should always terminate into a gully trap with an open angle shoe. And this will prevent blockage below ground level, causing water to back up. So you can see the images actually here, how it should look like. Where lengths of downpipe are joined at the faucet or the socket between lengths, this joint should be left unsealed or dry to allow backed up water to escape. And again, as we mentioned before, methods such as tanking may be simply trapping water and just driving it up the walls. So they are not the solution. It's just they address the problem rather than addressing the issue. Sorry, they address the result rather than the issue. Speaking about ground levels, again, raised ground levels, if that has happened because your building is adjacent to a pavement or a road, or just because of landslide, just make sure that these are lowered, especially if they're obstructing air vents or breaching a damp-proof course. So be mindful of pavements and any hard landscaping that are abutting your building. So that was a quick run over some of the things you can do to adapt your buildings to cope with the changing climate and changing weather. And you can see a bit more about this on our short guide 11, which you will see here to the right, which is all about climate change adaptation to the traditional buildings. And because we had a few questions which were more on energy efficiency, just to let people be aware that we do have published our latest case study, which is solely focused on Hollywood Park Lodge and the retrofit works that took place there, which is case study 37, you see here on the right. And we also recently published our new retrofit guide, which you will see online. And I'm hoping that we will get a link put up in the chat so you can check it out if you're interested in energy efficiency. So we'll be happy to take questions today. And let me just have a look, and I'll bring Roger in. Welcome Roger back in, and Molly as well. Hello.
Hi world, hello. We've got a few questions on the which have come in on the chat, and perhaps while other folk think of any things they might have, we can move along. So the first one I've got here, and I'll need a bit of help to keep me right, but Julie on Facebook, 1860s cottage, red sandstone, weather done damage, lots of cement, best way. So depending which type of red sandstone it is, it can be quite soft, and as I think probably has happened, it might have eroded away a little bit. So the previous folk reached for the cement, which is kind of fine for filling the holes, but it's not a great material for a softer stone. Hard to really give perhaps a detailed professional opinion without seeing a photograph, but generally what one might be doing is removing the cement, using a traditional quicklime based mortar to reinstate or certainly fill up the voids in the pointing. You may be looking at a bit of stone replacement too. Depending on the date of the cottage, it may have had a protective coating. Something tells me it probably didn't. By the 1860s, they were generally stopping external renders and things, as Leela indicated. So if Julie wanted to send her details through to our technical thing, we could perhaps comment a little bit further, or put you in touch with a charter surveyor or an architect who could perhaps advise on a bit more detail.
Yep, that's great. I mean, we have some questions just to say that they're very specific about insulation. So I will just firstly say, just have a look at our retrofit guide, which should be posted below on the links. And if you do have specific questions after you've looked at that, feel free to email us at technicalresearch@has.scot.
Yeah, that's the email address for that one. So Graham on Facebook, self-funding for self-installation. Not to my knowledge, no. It's not something we do. The Energy Savings Trust and Home Energy Scotland advise on insulation options. Certainly, I wouldn't. We tend to have grown materials or materials better to manage vapor than foil or harder materials. So, but have a look at the retrofit guide. As Leela said, that's really just out, published only 2 weeks ago. And ditto Carol's Facebook from her B-listed property. So happy to sort of take that forward. Did I see something from?
Yeah, there's a good question from Kathy on Facebook. What do I do about surface water draining towards the building and then soaking in by the footings?
Good. Well done, Kathy. You've clearly been listening to the brief and done some homework. So not a good situation. In fact, really bad. And some people are adjacent to pavements, which of course are looked after by the local authority, and it's harder for you to intervene. We have advised a couple of individuals with properties where that has happened, that the local authority has reformed the asphalt so that the wash is taking water away from the building. On your specific case, if it's your own driveway or parking area, try and lower that ground level, and as we've indicated, give some sort of slope for it to go back away from the house. Or if you can't do that, try and have it as open as you can. So a fine gravel is a good covering for adjacent to a building, not big rocks. Big rocks don't wick away moisture. So the the climate change adaptation guide does describe adjacent areas, I think, as well. So I hope that perhaps gets you started. Again, send us a photograph, might be able to give a bit more detailed advice.
We have another question from Richard of Facebook. Our property, Random Stone Rubble, was, I think, originally lime harled, and that was then replaced with cement at some point in the 20th century. That was then chiseled off by a previous owner. So we're back to the original stonework, which has suffered since from a degree of freeze-thaw spoiling. How can we stabilize this without rehardening the entire building?
Probably with a degree of difficulty, to be truthful, which is why it was done in the first place. What some people do is essentially a repointing, a flush point, as it's sometimes called, and there's some examples of that in technical paper 31, which shows perhaps how traditional finishes looked from surviving evidence. So I think probably my one there is is a flush point, but that won't protect the stone itself. Maybe a flush point and a lime wash would give a bit of integrity back to the stone, and because then the lime wash takes the abuse and the wind and the rain, and you can replace that very easily. Whereas replacing stone is a bigger job, much harder.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another question from Jane on Facebook. Recently saw hemp installation. Would this be suitable for historic buildings? Quick answer is yes, but Roger can expand.
Yeah. So as Lisa said, yeah, quick answer is pretty much yes. The sector here is maturing and developing quite quickly in what we're calling grown materials. And the reason there's benefits for these, both in their technical performance, they allow the movement of vapor and are also capillary active, and also that they capture carbon in their creation, so that you grow a plant-based product which sequesters carbon, and then that is used in the building to save operational carbon in terms of the insulation. So to answer Jane's question, yes, it would be various types, whether it's a softer roll or a stiffer bat, to be used in different parts of the building, depending what you have. And again, the retrofit guide gives a bit more background on the types of materials, and then how you can actually use them.
I mean, just to say, we have used it at our latest case study, Holly Park Lodge, case study 37, but it's not been mentioned in the case study itself, just because there were parts of the building that were done very recently with hemp, and just to trial it and also show people the use of that material. So yes, we have installed it, but it's not written up yet. Another question is from Martin on YouTube. You talk a lot about traditional lime mortars. For general pointing and repairs on traditional buildings, are there any downsides to its use compared to modern cement mortars?
Well, yeah, like all these things, it needs a bit more care with the application, a little bit more understanding on what's going on around it, and that's where the drip detailing that Lily was talking about earlier is of, frankly, primary importance, really. When people say downsides, I don't think so. I think it takes a little bit longer. You may find it a little bit harder to get trades to pick up on it, but if basic principles are followed, troweling, using like any material, preparation, execution and aftercare. I find it pretty good, to be honest. I use it quite a lot home myself, and it seems to do a pretty good job. It tends to be a bit brighter in color than grayish modern cement. So it's the same. It's a mortar, but it is kind of different in its nature. But that's just something to learn and get familiar with.
Great.
We have a short guide on lime mortars, which gives perhaps a fair bit of background on all this, some of the things to consider. So short guide, gosh, the one with the yellow cover, I can't remember the name. Somebody in the support team can do some nifty searching and paste that link up.
Yeah, I don't remember the name. I only remember that it's yellow.
Yeah, slap to ourselves.
But generally, just to kind of reiterate, I guess that lime mortar tends to be more flexible, which is quite good, especially if you have, I don't know, a little bit of movement in your building. I think, as long as it's not like serious movement. But generally, I find it better, whereas cement mortar tends to crack very easily.
So, cement is an excellent material for modern construction, motorway bridges, civil engineering, all that sort of stuff. And it's a great material, and it does have uses, but as Leila indicated, its lack of flexibility leads to the cracking, and the cracking on elevations leads to capillary draw in behind, and that's perhaps the weak point in it all.
Sorry, the short guide you were mentioning was short guide 6, and I think we're gonna have a link again put up in the chat box.
Yeah. Okay. Now, am I seeing another one from?
Yes, from Carl on Facebook. How do you go about finding tradespeople who are experienced with traditional buildings, with working with traditional buildings?
Yes, there's a reasonable coverage of folk in Scotland, and there's doing this. It's a bit of chicken and egg. We want people to ask for it so that main contractors, regular builders start using it. That there's no particular magic to it. It's just a different type of material. Most web searches throw up. It depends where you are in Scotland. Central Belt is fairly well served. Northeast of Scotland is pretty good too. I won't give a list over the screen here, but if you could email us.
Yeah, you can email us. We don't really have a list, but we might be aware of some contractors. But this is a problem that we do acknowledge, and I've had it myself. It's to find actually tradespeople who have experience and they follow the right approach can be quite challenging and difficult at times, because someone gets used to one way of doing things and they just do that, and they might not be open to like using lime, for example.
Right, here's an energy efficiency question that we'll probably need to cover. So this is about EPCs, which is the heart of the matter on the energy side. And my local EPC surveyor says there's no experience of hemp insulation, and you need a certificate. That's partly right. The EPC will not ask you what type of insulation it is. It just says what is the thickness of insulation that you have put in. I would suggest the EPC surveyor does some CPD and maybe looks at our retrofit guide. Hollywood Park Lodge had hemp and wood fibre, as we've described, and our EPC assessor didn't find that an issue. But what your EPC surveyor may be referring to is evidencing that it has been put in. So that could be images of the work being done, or some form of let's call it completion certificate. When you say registered fitter, you don't necessarily have to have, I don't know what registered means, but if you supply evidence, the homeowner supplies evidence to the EPC assessor that the work has been done. And that is my understanding of what's required, and that's what we did at Hollywood Park Lodge after the work there.
And just to say, because it's about fitters, so basically we ordered the installation separately, and then we had the joiners install it, if that's what you mean about fitting it.
So that's that one. There is definitely a bit of education for EPC surveyors across Scotland. There's been quite a dash into that particular market, and I think there's a bit of learning and development on all sides in terms of retrofit options going forward. So I don't have an immediate answer as such, but our experience was not an issue with that. But certainly proving the insulation has been put in and the thickness of insulation is important, as is indicated.
Yeah, another question from Kathy on Facebook. There are local rumors that a burn runs under the property. I'm not sure this is strictly true. There's a culvert on adjacent property, Crown Estate, which ought to drain it to the burn. But what if this is cracked or gets blocked? Can I get this maintained by the landowners?
So, so Kathy's right. Managing the water around you is as important as managing your roof and the chimney masonry and all the stuff that you heard about. So managing adjacent water is I think is a big part of this. You do hear it quite a bit, burns running under houses, and it's a really odd thing to do. I've never seen a dwelling house built deliberately with burns going underneath it. Mill buildings, industrial buildings quite often had water routed around because they used it for power. But adjacent culverts and drainage, if it is running free and you are more than 10 or 15 feet away from it, I wouldn't see that as an issue. If it is blocked, and the nature of the culvert means, as Kathy's indicated, is it blocked or is it cracked? I think you have a right to make sure that they don't flood you. And quite often part of the flooding story is water running off a hill or a road or a track that then comes down into properties. So you're not being flooded by water rising up from rivers. You're getting water running off from somewhere else. And I call this sort of critical infrastructure. And often if a culvert gets debris, leaves, bits of tree, twigs, sticks, it very quickly forms a complete plug over the opening, and then that water has somewhere to go. And I suspect that's what you're talking about. And maintenance and inspection of culverts is an important part of the local authority maintenance function for roads, and also for property owners and their obligations not to flood their neighbours. So I think you can ask them reasonably, is this running clear, please?
Great, thank you. Another question from Peter on Facebook. Would you consider 3.5 NHL as a suitable repointing line mix for a Wien 1860s building? We probably need to explain what NHL is.
Yeah, no, thank you, Peter. Fair question. So 3.5 natural hydraulic lime, NHL 3.5 is an indication of its strength, essentially. In kilonewtons per, it's its compressive strength in kilonewtons, essentially. So NHL is in the middle. That is actually quite a fair, in comparison with a traditional lime, that's fairly hard in terms of its makeup. I might be going for something a bit softer than that, particularly when you say it's windstone. So that is a hard, impervious mortar. So the joints are working harder to shift vapor and handle capillary water too. So my feeling would a gauged quicklime mix is probably more what we're talking about. It's looking like we need a separate lime session, doesn't it? And that's perhaps a good point to probably sort of hold on that one and say, let's get that in for perhaps in the new year.
Yeah, we're due to do a live on walls, so that could be one that we can cover that in. Another question from Graham on Facebook. We have various settlement cracks in our external stone walls and through internal brick walls. Who to approach for independent advice on soundness or not and remediation? Who won't try a hard sell?
Yeah, no, fair point. So generally, one of the defining characteristics of, let's call it, traditional or vernacular construction is a degree of flexibility of the component parts, including walls. But we're talking of sub-millimeter or less in terms of that movement due to changing ground conditions or changing humidities and other things. And settlement cracks and things are quite common and often legacy, but they should be quite small, and they shouldn't really keep happening. They should be static. A structural engineer is probably the person to approach for this. There are a couple of these folk in Scotland with conservation accreditation, so they'll have an understanding. If you do have brick, or if you do have cement renders or cement pointing, as I said, it's quite brittle earlier. That'll show cracking more than a lime, to be honest, and it may just be the nature of your material. Internal brick walls to see cracking is not common, to be honest. So there might be something going on with your building, possibly saturation of the ground underneath, which means it's more softer. The ground is more pliant, more, and also if there's water moving through it, you lose fines. You lose the fine parts of the soil, and therefore it loses volume and hence settlement, which will show up as possibly the cracking that you've talked about. So think about internal drains, what your sanitary arrangements are. Think about your domestic water supply. Might you have a tiny pin leak in the water main close to or adjacent to the house? So start thinking, why is it cracking? What might the causes of that be? And potentially a structural engineer, I'd suggest. I think any other trades are probably not necessarily qualified to understand the cause. There'll be lots of people offering you a solution and filling up those cracks with various things. But I'd get your head round, why is it happening, is the first question.
And to add to that, so first of all, for those for other people who are listening in and want to sort of read a bit about it, we do have an informed guide on structural cracks. We can link that up here as well. And the other thing is, if you do want to see if the crack is sort of live, you can buy those telltales, which you can find on Amazon quite cheaply. You just stick them where the crack is just to see if it's progressing. And that's to monitoring the building a bit until you get a formal opinion.
Yeah, or just stick some plaster into the crack and see if the crack moves away. That's a quick way.
Yeah. Another question from Alexa on Facebook. She is in an 1857 former keeper's cottage, and they've restored the sash windows but don't want to change the original handmade single glazing. Is there an economical way to reduce heat loss by adding secondary glazing in some way without affecting the appearance too much?
Yeah, fairly straightforward. First one, you might have internal timber window shutters, possibly, and we know that's a 50% heat saving bonus straight away. It does mean you're in the dark, of course. So secondary glazing is fairly well developed now. Several options. Flush with the staff beads means it's less visible and allows shutters. There are magnetic options with polycarbonate, which is quite light and very flexible. And there are also ways of doing secondary glazing on individual panes. Perhaps drop us an email and we can give you a few steers on that.
Just to say, because we only have like 10 minutes to go and we're getting a lot of questions on insulation. Not only we've done a previous live that you can actually watch on YouTube. They're all recorded there and they stay there on a playlist. But we have a short guide on windows, and we have our new retrofit guide that we keep talking about. And you can see all the solutions, all the solutions we've tried and are out there. There's more.
Yeah, I can see quite a few here. Shall we do a high-speed canter as best we can? Right. So suspended timber floors, 1910 cottage. Yes, that's easy. You will have to lift the floor and put down a wood fibre type material, as we've done in the guide there and at Holyrood Park Lodge. So have a quick look at that. It does mean lifting the floor, but yeah, dead easy and makes a massive difference. If your feet are warm, life gets better. Renovation groups and clubs, no, but that's not a bad idea.
It's a very good idea.
Yeah. Community enterprise. Yeah, that might need, I don't know. Yes, good idea.
But we're not aware of any. I'm only aware of a place where you can actually swap tools.
But happy to advise if a local group wanted to form, and I think that's a very helpful idea, and happy to steer them along and give them indications of where you might start and look and pool materials, and you've got a bit of buying power. Perhaps a community enterprise, would that be it? Community enterprise, yes, I'm not sure. Right. Next one, wondering about insulating the ceiling of a top bedroom. Yes, so when you insulate a roof, you do change the conditions in the attic space, which is partly why at the lodge we did a warm roof trial. My feeling is it's a balance between thickness of insulation and allowing just enough heat through into the attic to keep that space dry. The recommended thickness is 260 millimeters of insulation, which is very good for keeping the heat back, but it also means you have a very cold space above it. So you may want to make your own judgment on how that actually is delivered. How does sheep's wool insulation fare against insect attack? Yeah, that's a very fair question. It depends on the lifespan of the insect retardant, the insect poison, really, in terms of how you deter that, and also the conditions in which you put it. So if you have sheep's wool in a not particularly dry environment, the moths, and it doesn't have the proofing, you are slightly vulnerable. So I think that's perhaps just one to think about there. And then what's that?
From Neville on Facebook, 18th, 19th century property with unfortunate extensive cement repairs to lost hurling and further hurling failing. Can you recommend the necessary action?
Right. Very, very, very quick thing here. Probably, as you say, if it's coming off, you perhaps need to remove it. Some degree of repointing and maybe reinstating of hurling with a quicklime based render and a few coats of lime wash, or a flush point indeed. So hurling it varies in thickness depending what you had and the architecture, but in Scotland there's a tradition of flush pointing and lime washing too, which gives the weather protection that I think we're going to need after Molly's descriptions of the changing climate and how water is going to play on our buildings in the future.
And yeah, just to say, it was kind of pointed that Stirling City Heritage Trust may have had a scheme for I guess communities. I'm not aware of that, but I am aware that of the Traditional Buildings Health Check scheme, and that's quite a good one. It's not the same as a community sort of sharing and doing it all together, but they are quite good at providing independent sort of advice.
Yeah, so a repair, maintenance, and insulation collective. I can see something there possibly. Okay, I've now gone through the questions so quickly. We've now got 6 minutes left.
Let's see if there's any other questions coming in. But as we said, if it's something specific, you can just email us. And please have a look at the energy retrofit guide, because it is one of the most comprehensive ones that we've done. We pulled out data from our case studies and our previous sort of papers and guides.
Yeah, it's the follow-on from Short Guide 1, which we couldn't call it Short Guide because it was a very long guide. So we've called it Retrofit Guide, and it covers domestic scale retrofit work, and quite a lot of discussion on materials, circular economy, sustainability, and that side of the story. So the wider carbon picture, including ventilation. We need to get that right in where indoor health and the air quality we're living with is an important factor in refurbishment as well. Good. Okay. Well, I think perhaps that if there are any more questions, we've got a couple more minutes, but otherwise, thank you for joining us. Hope it was interesting.
Yeah.
And it looks like we need to run another insulation one probably, and probably a lime one too.
Yeah. So we had one last question about grants. What grants can be gained? Which we do get that asked quite a lot.
So
Roger,
yeah. So the grant story is we're not. There are some local schemes running, CARS, conservation area regeneration schemes, which do funding work in high streets and sort of conspicuous areas as part of a local regeneration scheme. Energy efficiency measures are partly in scope for that, but that is not a national scheme. That is a local scheme based on what the local authority are doing. Energy Savings Trust advise on eligibility for grants if you're in a vulnerable category. So at the moment, there aren't direct grants for this work, not from us anyway.
But have a look at Home Energy Scotland and Energy Saving Trust, because they deal with that and they can give advice as well. Let's see, if there's nothing else that is coming in, we might have to just wrap it up here. And we are getting some food for thought for the next lives. But thank you very much for joining us today. And a big thank you to Roger for doing all the questions and Molly for a great presentation. So we hope you enjoyed this and you found it quite informative. This is the last Inform Friday for this year, but we will hopefully be back for more next year.
Here's a question. Stop.
Yeah.
Right. Definitive way to diagnose dry rot. Have you tried the little sticks that cost 45 quid? Some people have good noses for food, for wine, and other stuff. I've got quite a good nose for damp, and crudely, dry rot will come and get you if your house is damp or areas of wet. So dry rot is something that's all around us. If we create conditions for it, it'll flourish very well. Came across in the 19th century from I believe it came in a shipment of timber from somewhere. You can tell the symptoms very easily by the mycelium, by the fruiting body, and sometimes by the smell. I've not tried the sticks myself because I kind of know the conditions that will get it, whether I've got the dry rot or not. So to some extent, if I find a damp area, I will assume that if I don't resolve that, I will get various types of rot, of which dry rot will definitely be one. The reason it's called dry rot is because the symptom, the fruiting body and quite a lot of the mycelium, is sometimes about a meter or so away from the source of the liquid. And invariably in most traditional buildings, that's a block down pipe, often in a corner, running water down the return of two walls, or indeed just a solid flat elevation. So I sort of look at the symptoms and what's around the building, the defects, and that's my cue as to be worried about dry rot or indeed other rots too. So almost get the building right and dry and well ventilated. You keep yourself safe from it.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I think that's all. And as I was saying, that this is the last Inform Friday for this year, but we'll hopefully be back next year with more. So make sure to follow our newsletter and check back in the new year for dates and topics, which are to be confirmed. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, please email technicalresearch@has.scot. And thank you again for joining us. Thank you to Molly and Roger, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a good Christmas. Goodbye.
Cheers now. Bye.
Bye.